Howdy, and welcome to Wise About Texas, the Texas History Podcast. This is your host, Ken Wise. Thank you very much for tuning in today for a little bit of Texas history. Been a busy spring. I've been off for away from the podcast for a little while. It's been a very busy spring. I wrapped up my term as the president of the Texas State Historical Association, which with our annual meeting at the beginning of March went very well. One of the biggest we've ever had, one of the best we've ever had. And the staff of the Texas State Historical Association, under the leadership of our executive director, J.P. Bryan, has just done a tremendous amount of work to turn that association around. So I encourage you, if you're not a member of the Texas State Historical Association, to join today. There's lots of new programming. The publishing is kicked back into gear, and you will enjoy being a member of that association. But now that I'm done as president, I can turn to the podcast a little bit. We did a few episodes back on the coming of barbed wire. I got a lot of great feedback about that episode, and one of the points of the episode about barbed wire, in addition to introducing you to where that fencing material came from, was the idea that it changed the nature of the countryside in Texas from a situation where animals were allowed to graze freely to a situation where people were marking possession of their land with those fences and preventing people from trespassing on their land, allowing them to preserve the integrity of their own pastures and manage those pastures however they wanted to do. And it also allowed them to improve the quality of their stock, since the breeding of that stock would be carefully regulated. Well, that all sounds really good. The problem was that there were plenty of people who didn't own land but owned livestock. It was possible at that time to become very wealthy by raising livestock because you didn't have to buy land. You could graze them freely over the range. If you've ever stayed at the Driscoll Hotel in Austin, the Driscolls were some of those free-range cattlemen who made their fortune owning cattle but no land. So conflict was almost inevitable because this was one of those situations where there was two very, very different ways of life, and they couldn't coexist with each other. And when that occurs, you are going to have serious conflict. The only question is, how far were the conflicting parties willing to go to settle their disputes? The answer is pretty far, and that gave rise to what's now known as the fence cutting wars. People who were advocating for the open range just decided those fences were unacceptable and they were just going to cut them. And so I'm going to talk about the year 1883 for a second, because that was kind of the beginning of the serious fence cutting wars. And all over Texas, wherever these free range cattle had been, and sheep, by the way, not just cattle, the fence cutters got to work and began to try and discourage the building of fences by simply taking them down. And did a little research in some of the newspapers of the time, and the fence cutters were fairly active, but also the fence builders were a little bit overactive too. So one story in June of 1883, the county seat of Archer County, which is Archer City, and y'all probably are familiar with Archer City as the home of the famous writer Larry McMurtry. At one point, the courthouse was closed in by a fence, and the access to the county seat was totally shut off by fences. In another situation in 1883, there was a very famous cattleman in the Brazoria County area named Abel Head Pierce. His nickname was Shanghai, so maybe you've heard the name Shanghai Pierce. He fenced, I believe it was 3 leagues of land, which is over 12,000 acres, put that under one fence, and fence cutters in the middle of the night cut every single strand of barbed wire on his fence. There was another dispute in Gonzales County where the fence builders were closing off the roads. Now, this was not uncommon. The people that were building fence would just cut off the roads. And well, if you think about it, you had free range, but you also had free roads. Just like cattle and sheep were traveling over the free range, people were traveling over the free range. And all these trails that we talk about, when you read history and you talk about not just cattle trails, but stagecoach roads and all of those sorts of things, those just went over people's land. Well, when they started building fences, of course, those fences would go across those roads and would cut them off. And there was a dispute in Gonzales County because the roads that the mail was being delivered on were getting closed off by fences. So at one point, the postmaster of Gonzales wrote to, again in 1883, wrote a letter to the U.S. attorney in San Antonio and asked, hey, can these fence builders build fences across these roads if the roads are on their property? And there was a letter published in the newspaper from the U.S. attorney that said that no, any road that was traveled by to deliver the mail was a post road and therefore under federal jurisdiction. And he closed the letter threatening anybody that attempted to interfere with post roads that they would be prosecuted in federal court. He also was careful to mention that anywhere a postman went was considered a post road. It didn't matter if it was a road like we think of a road or if it was just a trail through the brush. It constituted a post road if there was a postman on it. Yet another problem that arose was unscrupulous fence builders, not just fence cutters, but fence builders that would own land, fence it off, and then graze their herds on the open range while they let their fence pastures grow great grass. Now, that's not necessarily illegal, but you would have situations where they'd fence a little more land than they were entitled to fence. I suppose thinking that if somebody saw a fence, maybe they'd think it wasn't free land. Well, this got to be enough of a problem where the people involved started to organize. There was an organization formed in the early 1880s called the Law and Order Association of Tom Green County. I was reading an old article about this where the author said that the ranchmen were holding what he described as, quote, indignation meetings, close quote. So I think I would hope everybody listening will try to incorporate the phrase indignation meeting into your vocabulary. The fence cutters also started organizing, and they would name themselves the Owls or the Javelinas or even the Blue Devils. And they would leave warnings when they cut fence. They would, one morning in Castroville was a card with a bullet hole through it, and it said, quote, if you don't make gates, we will make them for you, close quote. Another, in Hamilton County, a gang cut the fence and left a picture of a coffin. And in Albany, Texas, they actually nailed a coffin, an actual coffin, to the fence post of a fence they'd cut. Down south in Live Oak County, one group destroyed a fence and actually took time to dig a grave with a rope dangling in it, and they put a sign up that said, this will be your end if you rebuild this fence. The local police were not super excited about dealing with these fence cutters because, of course, the fence cutters were local people. In Victoria, Texas, one time, there was a pasture within 3 blocks of the courthouse in Victoria, and it was cut up. That's how little law enforcement was undertaken. Now, the Texas Rangers would do a little bit better about enforcing the fence cutting, but there weren't enough of them to go around. Finally, all of this came to a head in about 1884, and the person who kind of led the charge in getting the legislature to do something was one of the cattle queens of Texas named Mabel Doss Day, who ranched in Coleman County. Her husband had passed away, leaving her about an 85,000-acre ranch. The problem was the ranch, as so many ranches were at the time, no comment on today, had a lot of debt involved. And so she ended up having to sell half of the interest in the cattle herd to of course, the locals considered foreigners, that is, people from Kentucky. Well, that just added fuel to the fire of the problem, and her fences were getting cut over and over, And she had a friend who was close to the governor. The governor at that time was John Ireland. So she lobbied the governor to get the legislature to pass some laws making it illegal to cut fence. So after going back and forth with Governor Ireland, he finally called a special session for January 1884. That's a special session of the legislature, and he decided. Now, fence cutting was occurring in over half of the counties in Texas. That's how widespread this problem was, and so it had to be addressed. And again, I'll repeat this, but this was a big change in the nature of how people viewed how the society should operate, because the English law, and I talked a little bit about this in the barbed wire episode, English common law, which made its way to America and then to Texas, required people to keep their livestock in. So it encouraged fencing and to keep your livestock off of other people's land or public land. And of course, the way of life of the open range was that all land was open to grazing. And more particularly, and the reason this all blew up in 1883, I should have mentioned this earlier, the reason this all blew up was there was an enormous drought during this time, and one of the most severe droughts in Texas history. And so when cattle needed water and they couldn't get to it, they just died because they couldn't get there because the water had been fenced. And so that's really what precipitated all of this. But as that special session of the legislature convened, they were going to have to confront a total turnaround in philosophy on how things had been done among stockmen in the previously wild and untamed and unfenced land of Texas. So the legislature got together. First thing they did was make it a felony to cut people's fence. Now that makes total sense to all of us today. You don't go around destroying people's private property. But they also made it a crime to fence land that was not yours. So they addressed both sides of the issue in what amounted to an acknowledgement in this huge change in Texas society. So now you're asking, did it solve the problem? And the answer is mostly. Although it did continue to be a problem into the later 1800s. One thing that happened, and this is Navarro County, so up in the Corsicana area, 1888, there were some fence cutting issues. So 2 Texas Rangers went up there on an undercover operation. Their names were Ira Ayton and Jim King. And they got in a wagon drawn by a mule and just wandered into the area as if they were laborers, and they got jobs. They got jobs doing general farm work, picking cotton, that sort of thing. And they got to know the fence cutters. And so they got some intelligence on where the fence cutters were going to operate, and Ira Ayton's idea was to get dynamite, make bombs, and string them along the fence. So the adjutant general, who was commander of the Rangers at that time, kind of had to rein them in a little bit and not told them to stop doing it that way. But they did put an end to the fence cutting in that particular situation, and it had pretty much died out by the 1890s as everyone got used to the new world order in Texas. So that's the story of the fence cutting wars, and that wraps it up for another episode of Wise About Texas. We don't really have a getting there segment today, because if you want to see barbed wire, you don't have to go very far. You can go anywhere and see the fencing that changed Texas forever. And that's the end of this episode. If you want to support the preservation and promotion of Texas history, go to patreon.com/wiseabouttexas. Like and share our Facebook page. You can find Wise About Texas on Twitter or Instagram at Wise About Texas. And this episode is being recorded and released in early April 2025. So San Jacinto Day is coming up. I'll be the featured speaker at the San Jacinto Monument on San Jacinto Day, the annual commemoration at 11 a.m. Come on out, introduce yourself. I'd like to see you. And your legislators are in session in Austin, so go down there and watch your government at work. But most importantly, go out and do something for Texas today. God bless Texas, and we'll see you down the road.